Agriculture is going far beyond nature to produce new miracles for an even better, more abundant life. The work of the men behind the scenes is done on the farm, in the laboratory, and in the marketplace. On the farm today, wherever you look, you see the handiwork of scientists. Improved crops, more productive soils, more useful, more efficient machinery. History teaches that a nation grows according to its agriculture, the very basis of life. And most of our children are stronger and grow up to live longer, eating more nutritious food thanks to more and more miracles from agriculture.
All of humanity's miracles start with agriculture. Without agriculture, we simply don't exist. The reality is we started our lives all those millennia ago by foraging for food. Eventually we learnt that we could bring food closer to us, that we could learn to adapt and to adopt. We could cultivate food and we could centralize it, ensuring that there was enough for all around. Over the millennium, we have continuously strived to find more and more miracles, to imagine what a future world of agriculture might look like. And over the last few hundred years, we've looked at inventing and innovating ways to make agriculture physically easier for human beings. And the world ahead is full of ever-increasing miracles. My name's Maurice Mizlowski. I'm a business futurist. And over the next week, you and I will be working together to understand what a future of agriculture might look like. In this first piece, I want to share with you some thoughts about the general epoch trends, the macro things that are happening to all of us on this planet, and then to ponder what their ripple effect might be on agriculture, on you and the industries that you're involved with. At the end of this piece, I'm going to set you some thinking. I'd love you to spend the next few days deeply immersed in that thought and come back to us with your beliefs, with your findings and where you think we might be ahead. When we come together in a week or so as a collective online workshop, I want us to think wildly and deeply about some of the ramifications of the things ahead for us. I want us to explore some of those nooks and crannies that we often don't have time to in our daily lives. You and I will be travelling down some roads, not necessarily to find conclusions, but to find beginnings, to find things that we might be able to take into a future of agriculture. You and I are going to see if we can create miracles, and we're going to do that by imagining a world ahead. So, let's start our journey into the future of agriculture. Across the physical and digital planet, there are many major changes happening around us, all of which are conspiring to change the world as we know it forever, and agriculture is not immune. I want to share with you now a number of the major horizon trends that are impacting on every industry. I'll share with you some examples around agriculture, and when we get together in a week, I want us to think broadly about the impacts of these, and more importantly, what you and I can do to respond to future needs based on these epoch changes. The first of these major shifts is in the way that we produce and the way we distribute. Over the last 150 years, in response to industrial revolution, we centralised our way of thinking, our way of being. And in farming, we ever increasingly looked for larger and larger plots to grow more and more on. It made perfect sense, given our labour force, given the mechanisation, and given our land availability. It was perfect to the time and situation. We then began to look at decentralisation as a notion of perhaps having smaller farms, or perhaps even having very different end product activities, like the notion of a vertical farm. Of instead of using large wide tracts of land, of going high like a skyscraper and producing food inside that, perhaps closer to an urban environment, doing more with physically less land around us, a decentralised approach. And we then began to ask ourselves, if that's the case, what about a distributed model? A model where we get ever closer to our end user, ever closer to the consumer. And we began to look at things like currently putting in place something called a sky farm, for example, which is going into a Melbourne construction due to break ground in the next year or so, where on top of the apartment block there will be a farm capable of producing 5 tonnes of produce per annum. This is a trend that's growing around retail spaces in Europe too, where a supermarket, for instance, might have a small farm on top of its roof, next to it in a car park, or perhaps even internally. But there's also another evolution in this trilogy, and that is the notion of peer-to-peer. This allows us to have things like farmers markets, where people are able to come into a very small regional area, others, consumers, become aware of it and go in and shop. But what about this for a strange idea? What if everybody had their own small veggie patch at home? Each of those veggie patches are connected together digitally. And through that digital marketplace, we're able to use what we produce for our own purposes as the grower, and then the excess that we have goes into a shared marketplace where people become aware of what we have and they either trade or barter, or we sell it to them. It sounds wildly new, but perhaps it's not. I'd argue, in fact, it's what we've always done as humanity. We went into a centralized village, we took what we couldn't use or what we wanted to sell, and we bartered or sold it for something else. Everything old is new again. Another of the major epoch trends around is the move towards what's referred to as an autonomous age, where you and I are now asking our technology to take a back seat, to step behind the curtain, not be so obvious, and instead of showing us the way that it operates by giving us large pieces of equipment, we're now saying to it, just tell us what we need to know. You go away with your swiftness, with your machine learning, your ability to look in every digital corner, nook and cranny across the planet. Bring me back what I need to know. And increasingly we're asking it to do even more, to make sense and purpose out of it, to tell me what you think is important out of the information that you've found digitally and bring it to my attention. Google Maps is a great example of that. We've gotten used to over the years moving away from a physical book where our maps were to a digital offering inside of a mobile phone or inside of our car. At first, it merely told us point A to point B directions, and we love that. But now increasingly what it's doing is looking at where we are, where we need to be, and understanding the entire trip from A to B. It's looking at the traffic conditions, it's looking at the weather, it's looking at things that we might want to buy, people we might want to see along the way, experiences we might want to have. And it is curating that entire end-to-end travel for us now and taking us down different roads, adjusting it as it sees fit according to what we need. We're seeing that now ride in all industries, and the agricultural industry, I think, is in fact one of the greatest vanguard examples of autonomous age actually existing. 15 years ago, when I began speaking to agricultural audiences, quite rightly the pushback was we can't even get internet. But over the years, through commercial reality, through the increasing inability to find people to assist to work on the land, and increased ability of technology, the agricultural industry has begun to look at technology as a way of being able to do far more with far less. This autonomous vehicle that everybody keeps talking about exists and has and is commercially available, of course, in agriculture. The ability to connect up to satellite, to learn about the land around us, the ability to share, to understand the soil, all of those things we now almost take for granted in the agricultural sector. Really, a lot of this is around the notion that we now have machine learning, the ability for a piece of technology to rudimentarily understand what's around it, but more importantly to gather information literally at the speed of light and to make sense and purpose out of it. And from this machine learning, we're growing into a concept of artificial intelligence, the ability for machines to be able to begin to make some of the decisions for us. Some of the first incarnations of this are around precision ag. Our ability now to not only use incredible human intuition, generations and generations of understanding what's around us, what the soil condition is, what's required. We can supplement that now with digital understanding, from satellites that have an understanding of what the weather is, from sensors understand what's happening in the soil, understand the growth rates, what fertilization is required, all of those things now, and we can digitize those, we can put numbers to them. Precision ag again is a relatively new landscape in the epoch of agriculture, and one that's set for enormous growth. It alone has changed and will continue to change what agriculture is, where it's done, how it's done, why, where and when. We're beginning to see readily available machinery like this Crop X, a device that is relatively inexpensive, available over the internet, that once delivered to you can be screwed into the ground. This bit of plastic about a metre tall begins to act as a sensor. It begins to interpret the environment around it, begins to interpret the soil, the conditions, the roots, and all sorts of other things, and gives it to you on a digital dashboard that is available either on a PC, a laptop, or on a mobile device anywhere on the planet. So we can now extend our thinking beyond being physically on ground to being anywhere. And we're seeing already ramifications of these sorts of devices allowing remote farming to become a reality. We're also seeing the increased use of robotics coming onto our land. Where before we might have used many hands to make light work, it now increasingly is impossible for a variety of reasons to find those many hands. So we're turning to mechanical hands, to mechanical thinking, to be able to do what we once did. And again, in that space, changing forever the miracles of what agricultural industry might be able to produce. We're also using machine language in a very unusual way. We're going out to our consumers, out to our manufacturers, out to the people that we would normally supply. And before we might have asked, and we still should continue to, what it is they want of us. We're now beginning to scour the digital globe to understand the trends, to understand what's being bought in restaurants, what people are asking for when they go into retail shops. We're beginning to scour social media to look for hints of what might be grown and when people require and what quantities and all sorts of other things. We're also taking another landscape, a very, very different one from one that agriculture might have thought of before. And that's our journey inside of our body. Increasingly, we're understanding how the human body works. We are beginning to place sensors around us in our mobile devices that tell us how far we're walking, what our breath is like, what our heart condition is like. And over the next decade and beyond, we will put these sensors into our body. What this gives us as humans is insight into how our body is operating, if it has any issues and what it requires. And guess what? A lot of what that requires has an agricultural base. As we increasingly begin to find and interpret this information, its impacts will push back into agriculture, what's grown, how, where, and when. These are the ripple effects of these epoch trends and the ones that we're still going to continue to look at that I want us to continuously strive and push against. Another of the major trends ahead is wellness and humanity. We've moved into an era about 5 years ago where we no longer wait for our body to break down. We no longer go to a doctor or seek intervention only after the pain begins. We're now beginning to take control of our body. We're now saying that we will do things to maintain our health and wellness for as long as possible. We're exercising more. We're being conscious about where and when we're sleeping. We're collecting information about our environment and how it impacts on our body and what we can do as individuals, as humans, to mitigate some of the concerns. And of course, a large part of this understanding is around the products of agriculture. It is the food that we are ingesting, that we are beginning to ask questions of, and we're beginning to look at in a very different way. Over the next 4 or 5 decades, we will increase our population from currently just under 8 billion to most probably somewhere around 10 billion by about 2050, 2060. The big difference that often is not taken into account is the reality that as a globe, by about 2060, we will have reached peak population and begin to decline. In Australia, that will not occur till 2080. But we're already starting to see some very, very different demographic shapes. We're beginning to see new generations arise, each of them with a different need and a different expectation of agriculture. We talked before briefly about trying to find people to work the land. Over the last decade or so, that's been a difficult chore. Often university courses have gone half empty or less, not being able to find students, as students who were traditionally born on the land decided to look for other opportunities further afield. Thankfully, over the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen an increase in people studying agriculture, going back to the land, perhaps not to do the heavy toil, but to do the work of tomorrow, the work of the future. And in Australia over the last month, there has been an increase in funding for the education sector, specifically around the study of agriculture. This, of course, will have ripple effects into the next years and decades as more and more people begin to look at agriculture for a career of the future. Just imagine what innovation and invention lies inside their hands, their hearts, and their minds. Another stark reality is that, unfortunately, as more and more humans come onto this planet, as we begin to live longer and increasingly towards 120, as more and more of our population reach middle class, with a belief that 80% of the world's population by 2050 will have reached that milestone of middle class, there is also an increase in chronic health and diseases. Agriculture plays a huge part in helping to prevent that, and as we'll see in just a couple of moments, to help to remedy it as well. Our global diet is changing, where there's a growing demand for high-value animal protein, and even that's not absolutely true. Again, as we'll explore in this conversation and in our workshop, there are many changes to the habits, to the requirements of the average dinner plate on the planet. We also, over the last decade or so, have increasingly, as consumers, been asking ourselves the most important question: where is our food from? What journey did it take? What does the farm look like? Did it use pesticide? What issues or concerns might I have about the food that I'm about to cook with or the food I'm about to eat? When I first started posing those questions 15 years ago to the agriculture, to the food and the broader sector, even though we thought it was a concern, we were still buying generic fruit and vegetables. We really didn't have a connection to the land as consumers. It was all just a generic orange that we bought from the supermarket, or a generic leek, or a generic apple. We really didn't have an understanding of provenance, nor a desire to understand it. Thankfully, over the ensuing decade, that's changed. Most people now want categorically to understand the journey of that fruit, that vegetable, that food product that they're about to enjoy. We're finding that apps like Thank My Farmer, that allows you with a QR code to understand the entire journey of that piece of produce, are now becoming almost necessary for many consumers. We have in-store merchandising that also pushes the same conversation, gives us story of farmers, shows us a farmer on the land, tells us where and how it was grown, segregates our food into organic, into mass-produced. I'm also sensing that there is a huge change in the way that we approach food purchase now. Increasingly in the West, what we're talking about is no longer buying ingredients, which was how we viewed going to a supermarket or a produce place. People now talk about sourcing items, and that vernacular is a semantic change in the connection between end user and grower. Also, thankfully, we are now pushing back onto the land itself to understand the origin, to go back to First Nation, go back to Aboriginal, go back to what we once understood about agriculture, that the things around us that were naturally growing had purpose. We just needed to understand what that purpose was. Increasingly now, there is a desire for mainstream to know that. I'm sure that this is a huge landscape moving forward around the agricultural industry. Also plays itself beautifully into that model we had to look at before with the distributed and the peer-to-peer models and others. And that's also one of the things I want us to do in workshop. We're going to see that many of the things we talked about in this piece and together are literally a layer upon layer conversation. We begin to see that many of these macro and micro trends are interweaving themselves into a tapestry of tomorrow's agriculture. We're also now talking about foraging for food, going back and understanding where it was grown. For many cultures, that's been quite ordinary. For Europe, for Asia, those things have been a part of everyday landscapes. In Australia and America, it's new to us and something that I'm sensing there is a great desire for. For millennium, there have been meat substitutes in the way of tofu, tempeh, and many others, depending on the culture and the recipe. But over the last 10 years, it's becoming a mainstream Western conversation. When I first broached the topic some 10, 12 years ago about us eating lab-grown meat, every audience member, everybody in the media thought it was a step too far, couldn't see how we might ever come to that. For me, it was an obvious possibility. I talked about a time where we would mainstream buy these things in our supermarket. And lo and behold, over the last year, 18 months, we now have aisles devoted specifically to these different kinds of meat substitute products. Expect to see that increase. And again, that shifts and changes the need for agricultural produce. Another of the shifts around this wellness phase is the understanding that what we ingest, what we eat, affects our body. And we're beginning to ask questions of the food. How can it assist us to ensure that we have the right gut health? And increasingly, as we begin to discover more about our body and how it operates, we will ask more and more questions that will require agricultural answers. And it's not just us that we're beginning to look at health and wellness for. It's our pets. One of the largest sectors at the moment in pet food is natural or organic food. And the third of the large epochs that are beginning to influence all of the thinking on this planet is the reality that we are headed back into space. For the first time in 30 years, our mind is now turning towards what we might be able to achieve outside of this planet. Our first conversation is not about having farms on Mars or on Moon. That will be something, believe it or not, that a generation from now will be considering. And over the next 5 or 10 years, we will be making motions towards. The conversation really is about innovating or inventing. It's about taking a landscape, a physical landscape in this case, agriculture, and reimagining it literally from its core, rebuilding it and reinventing it. And I love that journey, as I've alluded to many times in our conversation already. It's giving us the opportunity to rethink our end product. How can it be made, produced? What does it require in order to exist or to grow? It's in that journey that I think that the voyage to space is going to have its first major ripple effects on the agricultural industry. 3D printing has been talked about for quite a while, and there have been some additive printers that have allowed us to make chocolate and do all kinds of things. But we're now on the horizon plane of being able to logically speak about printing food. A recent example is 3D printed steak, where this group has been able to take plant-based inks and to be able to apply them in specific sequence to give us what looks like a steak and increasingly has the mouthfeel of one and the taste of one. Again, it's not about how it works now, but imagine what its children and grandchildren will be when we get 3, 5, 10 years into this technology, how it will change the nature of agriculture and what can be produced with plant-based foods, how, where, and when those things are produced as well. Here's another very recent example from a company called Roto Farm. These are small farms, literally like lampshades, that sit inside a consumer's home. It allows, without soil, without normal irrigation, and without normal pesticides, for us to be able to grow a variety of herbs and vegetables literally on our benchtop, using these space-like, NASA-like capabilities. We will see more and more of these on our horizon, again shifting the nature of agriculture and perhaps what it means to be a farmer. And one of my most favourite landscapes at the moment is this notion of digital twinning. It allows us to have not only a physical element, but also a digital facsimile, an exact copy of it. We're beginning to have them in all sorts of manufacturing for all sorts of plant and equipment. Over the last couple of years, we've increasingly used this in medicine, where we are pushing towards a notion where we will have a complete facsimile of ourselves. Not only will it externally look like us, but internally it will have all the machinations all of the internal organs, all of the way that we are different from everybody else. This is no different from agriculture. Digital twinning, for me, is the next major horizon. It allows us to look at the land in a very, very new way. It allows us to take those wonderful human skills that we have developed over the millennium and to augment those with real-time digital information. A digital twin in agriculture will allow us to collect and store data. It will allow us to look at the workflow, at how and when and where and why things are done, and to reimagine, repurpose, and to retry those. Again, we're talking about being able to do this digitally, to be able to maneuver the various machines and plants that we have on our land. And that's not the physical. Again, it's the digital. So we'll be able to literally move one thing to another thing. We'll be able to sequence them differently and to look at digitally the effects that have. If that makes a difference and we like the digital outcomes, we will then be able to apply it to the physical elements that we have on our land and the machinery and ways that we operate. We'll also be able to use it for autonomous thinking. We talked earlier about machine learning and artificial intelligence. These things will increasingly allow us to hook up to satellites, to ground sensors, to all sorts of things, and be able to have a true empirical understanding of what's happening in and around us. It will help us to interpret the soil, that most important of ingredients, and not only to understand it from a human intuitive viewpoint, but to empirically be able to understand what it is, how it is, and what needs to be done to it, and to share that message across the humans working in that space, and also the technology around it. We'll also be able to have the same understanding of our plant inventory, what's happening around it. It will be able to speak to us digitally, to give us the clues of the root structure, of whether it requires more water, whether it requires pesticide, or whatever else it needs to tell us. So from the inside out, we'll be getting these kind of first-hand information. And of course, the weather, the all-important weather. We'll be able to see that on a much broader scale. We'll be able to understand what weather might be coming to us from a much further distance and also across time horizons, and then to be able to plan as we need to, again using this digital twin. And lastly, our technology, our digital twin, will forever 24/7 rain, hail or shine. We'll be looking for false positive stresses across our entire digital landscape. It will be looking for things that aren't right. It will be looking for the pests. It will be looking for the root rot. It will be looking for where irrigation is not as it should be. And it will be sending those messages to us, flagging it, making us aware of it. And with our permission, sending technology where it's appropriate out to remedy and rectify. This digital twin of agriculture is bringing all of the physicality that for millenniums we have taught ourselves and we know into a new landscape of digitization where zeros and ones are now part of the equation of tomorrow's landscape. Neither are more important than either. But collectively, imagine what the future of agriculture might be. We've just explored some of the major epochs, some of the major horizons around that are shifting and changing forever humanity and all of the industries and the way that we live, love and work into the future. I've touched briefly on some of the ways that I think it might impact on agriculture. But as always, you're the expert. I need now to hear from you. Over the next week, I'd love you to ponder some of the things I've just explored with you, to look around you and to bring to our attention next Thursday the things that you think are important over the horizon, that collectively we need to be thinking about and exploring in greater detail. There are some questions I'd love you to think about and answers I need you to provide over the next few days. I'm excited by what we might find together next Thursday. I'm anxious to have the discussions with you and see what's important in a future agricultural landscape. And most importantly, getting to know each and every one of you. So together, we can peer into the future of agriculture. See you next week.